Hello, my name is Pascale Harrison and I'm the long-term conditions lead within the BNSSG, and this is the second part of managing long COVID related fatigue, and the first part was kindly done by my colleague Paul O'Sullivan, who did part one of this webinar series. And I'm going to be taking it further in this second part to talk more about how fatigue might be affecting you following COVID-19, and also a little bit about some of the strategies that you can use to help manage the fatigue and some of the effects that COVID can have on how you might be feeling and what kind of resources you may be able to use. But first of all, I'm just going to cover some of the points that Paul, my colleague, talked about in the first part. So COVID-19 and fatigue. So fatigue is a normal reaction to having a viral infection, and it's our way of our body helping to recover from it. It's estimated that it can take several weeks. So some people may take 4 weeks to recover, whereas up to 12 weeks. Although there are some people that experience the symptoms much longer than 12 weeks, and there is more research being done to look at those experiencing symptoms for a much longer period of time. So we know it might take some people longer to recover. And some people may go on to develop what is called long COVID, and some of this advice we're going to be talking about in this webinar may be useful for those experiencing those kind of symptoms. And as we're thinking about COVID, we know that prolonged fatigue is one of the most common related symptoms, but we know that also people may be experiencing other symptoms. So they may still have cough, there may be breathlessness, they may have muscle aches, they may notice more headaches, and there might be more difficulties with their stomach and digestive system. So we know there may be other symptoms that go alongside the fatigue. And we know that also it can be having other health conditions. So if you have pre-existing cardiac issues, or you may have difficulties with your respiratory system, it may also be sort of adding more stress on your body from experiencing COVID-19. So thinking about some of the rates of fatigue, so there has been lots of different studies that have been done, and they're suggesting that 10% of the 3.9 million people that have experienced COVID experiencing fatigue after 4 weeks. And there's been a big research study looking at COVID symptoms. So there was a COVID symptom app study where they looked at people monitoring their health and being able to use some of that information for what people entered into the app. And for the majority of people, they noticed that people were back to normal within sort of 11 days. But then there were people, like 1 in 7 had symptoms for 4 weeks. And then those 1 in 20 that stayed ill for 8 weeks. And then there's going to be a population of 1 in 50 that may suffer longer symptoms than 12 weeks. So there's some new research that is coming out to be able to look at the whole process a person might go through when they experience COVID and how it might relate to their fatigue. There's also been some research looking at the difference between ages as well, and thinking about whether young people or older people are more likely to experience symptoms of fatigue and then go on to develop long COVID. So potentially there's less of a population of those experiencing it with the younger age group than those in the older age group. So it sort of rises for those people in their sort of years of 70 years old. But people can experience it from any age, so it's not something that's particular from one age group, but we know the percentage of people as they get older may have more risk of developing long COVID and experiencing fatigue for longer than 4 weeks. And they've also done some research looking at gender. So there's some research suggests that men are more likely to be admitted to hospital with COVID, but women appear to likely to suffer more from long COVID symptoms than men. But these are just some new research findings that are coming out, and as time goes on there may be other additional findings, and some of that data may change because it's an ever-changing situation as they collect more and more data about COVID and how it's affecting people. But there seems to be some connection, if we were to summarise, with a person's age, whether the male, female, and also if they have any other health conditions as well. So as I was thinking about fatigue, we know that there's other health conditions that may experience fatigue, like those with chronic fatigue syndrome or those with cancer. So there may be many different health conditions experiencing fatigue, but some of these health conditions may be connected to a viral infection, which is the same as sort of COVID. So we may see that with those with, say, TFS, ME, and those that may have had previous viruses in the past as well. So we know that there could be that potential of the infection causing higher rates of fatigue. So what can you do if you do notice that you have fatigue and the symptoms are not disappearing? So one of the options, if you continue to have fatigue after 3 to 4 months, this may be a point where it could be useful to contact your doctor. And there's a really good website that's full of resources called yourcovidrecovery.nhs.uk. And this has many different resources of how you can manage your COVID symptoms and what you might be able to do to get on that road to recovery. And so it's definitely a really good resource to be able to use. But I suppose some things to think of if you're noticing after you've experienced COVID and after the initial infection's gone away. So if you're noticing you're having fatigue after 3 to 4 months, there's no improvement with your fatigue levels, and possibly if there's new symptoms. So if you may have noticed headaches, breathlessness or chest pain, it may be worth consulting your GP or those that other health professionals that might be involved in your care. So I was thinking that you may be having some of these side effects of fatigue. What can you do to be able to manage your activities? So there has been some suggestions about how you may be able to do this, and part of that's connected to how you can conserve your energy. So it's thinking at the beginning that as you get back into doing activity, this may take time and you may need to lower your activity levels. And thinking about conserving our energy and what we're doing, 3 different principles can be really good to try and put that in place in our daily lives. So the first suggestion is thinking about pacing, how you might plan and how you might prioritise your activities. And what we're going to do is talk through each of these points and what is pacing and how this might affect your fatigue levels and your activity, how you might plan and how you might prioritise. So thinking about pacing, this is a technique that's often used with those with persistent or chronic health conditions. So it's a well-established technique that people often use as a way to be able to manage a consistent level of activity. And we know when a person's had a viral infection such as COVID-19, that your activity levels may have completely changed, because at that point you've been coping with the viral infection and been able to body to fight off the infection. So whether that was managing it at home or in hospital, your body would have been doing lots of additional work to cope with it. And lots of things that you would have taken for granted in your daily life, you may have stopped doing. So thinking about pacing, it's a way of perhaps starting to do some activity again, and how you can do it so it's not increasing the level of fatigue or other symptoms that you might be having. So the aim of pacing is to be able to have a balance of activity and rest. And there's sort of 4 elements when it comes to pacing. So part of it is thinking about our sort of level of activity that we're going to do, having some rest, and also thinking about that relaxation and being able to have established a sustainable sort of baseline of what you're able to do and how you might increase your activity as you are able. The type of activities that you will pace will depend upon how the severity of COVID and how much its impact is on you. What might be your general basic tasks of daily living, and how other aspects of your commitments, responsibilities might be affecting you at this current time, what you normally would do, your routines. So there may be different levels of activity for each person and where they might be in their particular life and their roles. But there'll be certain level of activities that you may be able to pace. I was thinking about our baseline, and that's very much is thinking about the activity you can do on a regular basis. So before COVID, it may have been that you were able to do lots of activity and you may not have given a force about having fatigue or having that experience of feeling exhausted with the activity that you're doing. And you may have been able to do everything very easily without any difficulties. So your pre-baseline before COVID may be different to the baseline of activity that you're now able to do. And it's useful to think about what you're able to do right here, right now, just thinking about in that recovery state from COVID. So I think the idea is to be able to think about doing a similar amount of activity each day, regardless of whether you're having a good day with symptoms or whether you're having a bad day. And the idea of that is sort of helps you to keep to a certain amount of activity without overdoing activity. And we can talk about on the next slide about what can happen if we find ourselves doing too much activity. And I can talk about that a little bit more. So thinking about the baseline, it may be looking at doing slightly less than what you were able to do before, or what you're able to do now, and thinking about starting off at that set point of activity and seeing how that can go. So for example, it may be if you're able to do sort of 30 minutes of housework, but actually you bring that down to sort of 20 minutes to be able to try that and see if that's a reasonable amount of activity you're able to do on a regular basis over several days. So I think a really good point is looking at how much activity you can do without making your symptoms any worse, so making that fatigue any worse. And being able to try that for a period of time before licking and increasing those level of activities that you're doing. So I suppose that comes into how we might use the boom and bust cycle. So the boom and bust cycle is a really good illustration of what can happen when we try to make up the days where we're not having good days. So we can almost have two sort of styles of activity. So we can go into the point where we're doing overactivity. So we may find that if we're having a good day, we try and do lots of different things. So whether that is perhaps phoning people and doing things on emails, and whether that's housework, whether that's going for a walk. So that could be being really active. And then what can find is by doing that, it gets to the point where we're not able to do any more, that we've done too much activity. And then we find that it could be a flare up of our symptoms. So we may notice we have more fatigue. There may be other symptoms that connected. So if we notice we're becoming more breathless, or if we have existing health conditions, we might notice then we have an increase in pain or other symptoms we experience. So we reach a point where we can't do any more. And then we need to take that rest to be able to manage that fatigue. So then we stop doing activity. And then when we're at a point where we feel actually I can do activity again, we might then increase and try and make up for the activity that we could no longer do. And so then we go back up to trying to get everything that we may have not been able to do a day or a couple of days, and then we do some more. And then we find we need to have a rest because we experience more of a flare up of symptoms, and then we go back down. So you can see on this graph that we end up doing activity, and what happens is the rest times get larger because we need more time to recover. And the level of activity we do can actually get less. So then we might form into a pattern of under activity where we may be doing less activity because we may have some worries or concerns about whether we can actually do the activity. So we can find it can work in two ways. So we have the overactivity, or we can have the underactivity. So it means that we can go into this whole boom and bust cycle. And the idea of pacing is to try and reduce some of those ups and downs and being able to do a regular amount of activity every day, with the aim of not increasing the flare up of pain, fatigue that we might feel. And especially this may be really relevant if perhaps you're starting to introduce some activities again, especially where you may not quite know how much feels reasonable and realistic to be able to do. So this can be really mindful to think about whether am I going to overdo my level of activity by what I have planned today, and will this cause perhaps additional symptoms? And one of my suggestions of how you might be able to notice some of these patterns can be to keep a diary, especially those early days when you are starting to do more activity again, or if you're noticing that you might be going in this pattern, it can be useful just to write down how long you're doing activity for and what kind of activities you're doing as well. And because one thing we know is the type of activity that we do can also affect how much energy that we have, and also can affect this boom or bust cycle. So some of us might think about activity that may use high amounts of our energy, maybe things like more mental stimulation, so using computers, perhaps emails, doing pieces of work, or it could be more physical activities such as exercise or going shopping or lifting heavy things, whereas there might be some more medium amounts of activity that use less energy, which might be perhaps speaking on the phone or watching television, whereas low activity may be things as being able to listen to music, being able to rest on the sofa. So there may be different types of activities, and that will all use different amounts of energy, and it also affects your overall activity levels of what you can do. And this may be something you've not had to consider before in the past, but now due to contracting COVID, it may mean having to have a look at how you spend your day and the spread of activities. So I really like this cycle because I think it really shows that sort of pattern of what can happen when we're experiencing fatigue and how we might end up in that whole boom or bust cycle. It really sort of is a good illustration of how it can affect us. So we might find ourselves wanting to push ourselves to undertake activity, and then we may keep doing it until the fatigue makes us stop. And then we notice then we may take some rest time, and then we might then push ourselves again until the fatigue makes us stop. And then we might rest, and then potentially we may feel exhausted again, and then we then may take to the bed to be able to manage that fatigue that we're feeling. And we can talk a little bit about some of the reasons why we might push ourselves to undertake activity. And part of that may be related to what we usually be able to do before COVID and how that might influence what we currently can do. But what we can see is by doing activity and keep going until those fatigue levels get worse or increase, it might mean then we're taking that rest, and it can mean additional feelings of fatigue and then not being able to do activity, and possibly then this might impact on how you're feeling as well. So thinking about pacing and some of the top tips, there are some tips of how you might be able to pace. Some suggestions can be to look at doing small tasks often, being able to build rest into the days. So possibly one suggestion can be if you were doing an activity, then it would perhaps then mean taking that rest before then doing another activity. And this may be a complete change to your previous lifestyle that you may have had, where you perhaps you're not needed to have those rests and you've been able to go for much longer periods of time of having that prolonged concentration of spending hours doing activities, whether that's things within work or things at home or exercise, and then needing to take that additional time. And part of it can be sort of working out what is your baseline. So how much can you do without making the symptoms worse? And if there are additional symptoms, such as feeling breathless, it may be one of the suggestions could be slowing down, perhaps when talking or eating or when moving, and to be able to help with those breathlessness symptoms as well. So that's one step, is thinking about how we conserve our energy, is the pacing. The next part is thinking how you plan this. So it may be looking at your normal activities that you do and how they might be spread out of different types of activities. And perhaps it might be considering what is essential, what is it that I need to do to be able to get my self-care, things that I need to in the house, what are things I definitely need to do. We may need to ask for help from other people as well if we need to perhaps delegate some roles or responsibilities that we might have found really easy to begin with, but actually might be more difficult now the fatigue is lasting. And also, as I've already suggested, having perhaps a weekly schedule where you can see some of the activity can be useful to sort of know what might be a reasonable baseline to start off with. But actually, as time goes on, it can be helpful to see how you might be able to increase that level of activities as time goes on. And I suppose part of this is seeing this as being the first steps that people can then increase their level of activities as time goes on. But first of all, it may be considering what might be essential activities that you need to keep within your day-to-day. So I suppose this links on to prioritising. So some tasks may be necessary, but others may not be. The part of it is being able to ask yourself, what do I need to do today? What do I want to do for today? So there may be some aspects that are essential, but actually what might be helpful for ourselves as well for our overall recovery. And that might be planning some things that may be more enjoyable for us to do. So this comes into how can we be kind to ourselves. So thinking that you've experienced a viral infection, so having some rest can be really important for your body. And I suppose it's been able to keep that stimulation of our mind and body to a minimum to begin with, and then gradually over time increasing it. And just giving yourself that time to be able to recover. So you may have noticed from this webinar series and also from my colleague speaking in part 1 that people may respond differently to COVID-19, and not everybody experiences it in the same way, whether they have a period of 4 weeks of fatigue or whether actually those symptoms last longer. And also it doesn't always make a difference on the severity of the virus. So whether somebody was hospitalised or somebody who wasn't, that potentially people could experience fatigue even if they wasn't in hospital. So people can have it from a very individual perspective of their fatigue and how much COVID has impacted their lives. And you may feel under some pressure to return to normal activities, so whether that is going back to a place of work or whether that's resuming roles in the home or childcare or other responsibilities. I suppose it's been able to give yourself that time that you can recover and to be able to do activities to minimum and to be able to then to build up those activities. There's other aspects of what might be helpful for us within sort of early stages and as fatigue continues, is to think about whether having some sensory tools that can help us to be able to feel that it can reduce some anxiety, that can help reduce stress. And everybody may have different things, but some situations or some examples may be things like fragrances, blankets, music, that all might help to create those feelings of safety and calmness as well. And promoting sleep is also another important point, and it can be affected when we have a viral infection, or if we've needed to go into hospital, we may have had the whole sleep pattern disrupted. And for a lot of people, they may have had normal sleep patterns before COVID, and that might now be completely different. So we're going to talk on another slide about some strategies to help with sleep. Nourishment also is another possibility. So being able to think about keeping hydrated, being able to think about how much food we're having, and be able to ensure that we're eating regularly, because maybe when we've had a viral infection, we may not have felt in the place to keep those levels up. So it's looking at how we might be able to do that now. I suppose it also is thinking about keeping our activity low, and so being able to reduce your baseline of activity and then how you might be able to increase it over time. So one suggestion is that you could perhaps increase it by sort of 10% every week or every couple of weeks, depending upon how you're getting on with your level of activity. But you may have to consider if it's impacting on any other symptoms at that time. Relaxation also can be helpful when we're experiencing fatigue, and it can be good if we're experiencing any levels of anxiety and low mood. And there's different levels of exercises as well that you're able to do. Some might help increase that more body awareness, and they can be such meditation as the body scan, whereas some might increase our breathing patterns and to help with our capacity of our breathing. So we may look at different relaxation and different techniques to help different things, whereas others might revolve with looking at sort of muscle tension, like progressive muscle relaxation, where that involves being able to tense and relax our muscles. So we might use that in a way to manage if we're having any tension in our body. Another option is also to think about how we might stay grounded in the moment. And such a technique that some of you may already be aware of is to use the 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 technique. And the purpose of this is to be able to take the details of your surroundings and what's happening with your senses, and perhaps strive to notice some of the small details that your mind will usually tune out to, such as distant sounds or the texture of an object. So the idea is to think about 5 things you may be able to see. So look for small details such as a pattern on the ceiling, the way light reflects off a surface of an object you've never noticed. Then it's thinking about 4 things that you can feel. So notice sensation of your clothing on your body, the sun on your skin, or the feeling of the chair you're sitting in. Pick up an object and examine its weight, texture, and other physical qualities. What are the 3 things that you can hear? Pay special attention to sounds your mind is tuned out, such as ticking clock, distant traffic, or trees blowing in the wind. And what might be 2 things that you can smell? So try and notice the smells in the air around you. Like if there's an air freshener or freshly mowed grass, may also look around for something that has a scent, such as a flower or an unlit candle. And what might be 1 thing that you can taste? So it may be carrying gum, having mints, candy, and this may then give you an opportunity just to focus on the flavours and that sensation in your mouth. So that's just an example of something that you're able to do in your everyday life, just to ground you in that moment and be aware of what's happening around you. But there's many different relaxation, guided imagery and mindfulness exercises to try. And probably a really good starting point is having a look at the NHS apps library, and this gives some suggestions of some relaxation apps that you might be able to try. There's a whole different range of them, and unfortunately we can't go into all of these relaxation exercises on this webinar, and everybody has different preferences. But this may be something that can help you to reduce some of those anxiety or any tension in your body, and might also aid your recovery. So thinking about COVID and the impact that it may have had upon us, that for some people before COVID, they may have been able to do things without any difficulties. And then after COVID, there may be some worries about not getting back to those pre-COVID levels. And we might have really high expectations of what we're able to achieve in our day-to-day life, and perhaps not able to reach those standards that we currently set ourselves because of having the infection. So it may require some time to get back to those pre-levels that we're at before. So some strategies to try and help with that, if you find that is causing some difficulty, could be being patient, recognise what you might be achieving. So if you have been able to do some activities, really noticing that. Also try not to be disappointed if recovery seems to be slow. Be compassionate with yourself, and sometimes being able to talk to other people about your feelings of recovery or how they might be able to help you with some of your activities can also be really helpful. And that's just part of bringing this up, is just being aware of how we might have certain expectations of what we're able to do, and how it may be, understandably, may be really difficult to be able to do that straight away, and how we might build up to those previous levels of activity. We know with COVID that people may have had different severities and may have managed COVID at home to those that are in hospital or those who are in the critical illness care units. So people may have had different experiences of COVID and different range of symptoms. Now, for some people, this may affect how they are feeling. So possibly there could be some anxieties. So there may be some worries about not returning to previous levels. There could be some worries of contracting COVID again, anxiety about being in public places. Some people might experience some low mood, so there may be some low mood connected to not getting back to those expectations or those previous levels, and what that can mean for us if we're not able to do things of activities that are really important to us. And possibly with fatigue, it can really affect our interest and our enjoyment in activities, and potentially that then may make us feel low in mood. For some people, there can be a fear of further illnesses. So depending upon the nature of the symptoms and what you experience with COVID, this might have caused an increase of scanning your body for additional symptoms as well. So for example, if you experience more breathlessness, or you may have had some chest pains, if you were then to have more episodes of breathlessness or chest pains, this might lead you then worrying about, what does this mean? What does it mean if I have chest pains or I'm feeling breathlessness at those times? And possibly it can be worth speaking to a GP if those additional symptoms become a persistent problem. Other people we know may have that fear of worries about contracting COVID for other people. So perhaps having people within your close unit at home or friends or work colleagues, and those worries about what would happen if they were to contract COVID. And also what it might mean to sort of self-isolate for that period of time. But some people may have worries, or going back into the workplace as well. We also know, and you probably would have had some information as we've gone through these webinars, is that people have different experiences of COVID. So some have been really critically ill, very poorly, and may have been hospitalised, maybe having prolonged ventilation, maybe in a critical care unit, whereas other people may have managed it at home. So some people may have some intrusive memories of those experiences and how that might have made them feel, and some of those anxieties related to this. If this is the case, we suggest speaking to someone involved in your care. Although for some people, it might have generated some positive emotions and feelings of gratitude that they have got through and survived COVID. So it can be a whole range of different feelings that people have. One area we know that COVID can affect, or can affect with other viral infections as well, is difficulties with sleep. So it may really disturb your natural sleeping patterns. So thinking about strategies to help with sleep, and you may want to access some more sleep hygiene strategies, is to perhaps look at going back to basics of sleep, sort of using a bed for sleep only. If you're not able to get to sleep sort of after 20 minutes, being able to get up and do a small activity and then trying to go back to bed. I suppose this is when the relaxation, breathing or mindfulness can be really useful to help prepare you for bed and be able to calm and relax your body. Other options may be thinking about things that you're grateful for, or perhaps looking about your thoughts, aware that there may be many different worries and thoughts that you have in your mind, and it may be sort of perhaps writing down if there are difficult thoughts that are affecting you, your sleep, and thinking, this thought, it will be there tomorrow and I can then manage that problem or that worry tomorrow. So there may be different ways to try and help manage your sleep. Thinking about returning to work, so after a period of not working, it can be a sort of challenge going back and managing levels of fatigue, shortness of breath and problems of concentration. So some possibilities of thinking about reasonable adjustments. What might be graded return to work? Some really useful websites are the Fit for Work, so the government scheme that can provide you advice on work-related health issues, or it could be looking at your COVID recovery NHS UK website, so it has a whole section about returning to work, or talking to GP and other professionals about how you may go back to work in a graded return. So there's all different possibilities of how you might go about that and what might seem a reasonable level of activity to start off and be able to build up. So thinking about managing setbacks. Increasing symptoms may occur during your time in recovery, especially if you're starting to reintroduce some activity, such as going back to work or perhaps seeing people or doing exercise. So possibly there could be an increase of symptoms, but it may take time for that then to reduce. But what might be useful is to always think about what might have triggered other symptoms, so whether it's any stressful events, any other further infections that might impact upon it. And sometimes we may need to go back to that original baseline and know perhaps our expectations of what we're able to do within a day, and then to be able to go back and increase that levels of activity. So just think about how much energy that we have and how much is realistic to help us get through that day. Another option can be to vary our activities so that we're having some activities that are using more of our mental stimulation and using more of our physical abilities like exercise, but also having some which offers us rest and that we're not doing so much physical activity. So that can be useful. So thinking about some useful resources for those people that might be interested in more relaxation or mindfulness as a way of being able to aid your recovery and reduce that tension and anxiety that we might feel. It's a whole range of different free mindfulness classes that people can access online. There's also your covidrecovery.uk. It's a really useful website, or accessing NHS apps also can help with our mental health. And also the Royal College of Occupational Therapists have also produced some really good leaflets about how you can conserve your energy when being able to build up after COVID and how you manage building up your activity. Thinking about our contact details, so thinking if it's affecting how you might manage pre-existing health conditions, or if it's related to noticing there's more increased anxiety or low mood. VitaMinds can be a useful service where you may be able to talk about how it's impacting on you, and we have different services within the country. So the best option is to be able to use our Vita Health Group website, and you're able then to look at our sort of local details of VitaMinds, or there's also an email address for you to get more details on how to contact us, and if you wanted to make a referral for yourself or for anybody else. So I just want to say thank you for listening, and thank you to my colleague, Dr. Paul Sutherland, for doing the first part 1. And if there's any questions, then you can always contact us, inquiries@vhg.co.uk. Okay, thank you everybody.